Someone told you a lie a long time ago, and you have spent years, quiet, unremarkable years, ordinary Tuesday after ordinary Tuesday, building your entire life around it without ever once stopping to check if it was true. You did not question it, because the person who told it to you never framed it as an opinion. They framed it as a fact. And because you were young, or tired, or desperate to be loved by them, you accepted it the way a child accepts whatever the tallest person in the room tells them about the world. Tonight, I am going to tell you what that lie actually was, and I am going to tell you why you still, to this very moment, do not fully know it. Stay until the end of this video, because the moment you finally see this lie clearly, for the first time in your life, is the moment everything else about how you see yourself begins to change, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way most real transformation actually happens. You may be wondering why a message like this would find you tonight of all nights. Out of every ordinary evening, you could have been scrolling instead. I cannot tell you the specific mechanics of how these things work, only that it is rarely as random as it feels in the moment. Something in you clicked on this video instead of 100 others. And something in you is still listening this far in instead of closing it the way you close most things that get uncomfortably close to the truth. Trust that instinct for a few more minutes, because the rest of what I have to say was written for exactly the person who stayed this long. I am not talking about a stranger. I am not talking about someone who deceived you about money, or an affair, or a business deal gone wrong. Those lies hurt, but they are simple compared to the one I am describing tonight. I am talking about someone who had real power over how you saw yourself in your most formative years, a parent, a teacher, an early relationship, a mentor, someone whose words did not simply pass through you the way ordinary criticism does. Their words moved in and stayed, quietly furnishing a room inside you that you have been living in ever since without ever questioning who built it or whether it was ever meant to be your permanent home. This is not a small thing to carry, and I do not want to move past it too quickly. Most people spend their entire lives never once tracing their adult patterns back to a single origin point, living instead inside the vague, general feeling that something is simply wrong with them, without ever locating the specific moment or the specific voice responsible for planting that feeling. You are about to do something most people never do. You are about to trace the thread all the way back to its source. Here is the first truth of tonight's message, and it is heavier than most people are ready to hear. Somewhere in your life, someone told you who you were, and you believed them completely, and you have spent every year since then either proving them right or exhausting yourself trying to prove them wrong, never once stopping to ask the only question that actually matters, which is whether they were ever telling you the truth in the first place. Think about the specific words for a moment, because I suspect you already know them, even if you have never said them out loud to another person. Even if you have spent years dressing them up in kinder language, whenever you tried to explain your own insecurities to yourself or to a therapist or to a friend late at night. Maybe it was, "You're too much," spoken by someone who found your intensity inconvenient, rather than remarkable. Maybe it was, "You will never amount to anything," spoken by someone who was projecting their own quiet failures onto the one person too young to defend themselves against it. Maybe it was, "You are not lovable the way you are," spoken by someone who left before they ever had to face what those words would cost you for the next 20 years. Whatever the specific sentence was, it became the lens through which you have interpreted almost everything that has happened to you since. And here is the part that will genuinely break your heart tonight. You have mistaken that lens for your own eyesight. You have forgotten, somewhere along the way, that someone else handed it to you, and that you were never actually born seeing yourself the way you see yourself now. But stay with me, because this is only the surface. What comes next is the part most people are never told, and it is the part that will change how you understand this entire message. Let me tell you about a woman who spent almost 30 years living inside a single sentence her mother said to her when she was 11 years old. Her mother, exhausted and overwhelmed by a difficult marriage and more responsibility than any one person should carry alone, looked at her one evening and said, "You are just like your father." In a tone that made it unmistakably clear, this was not meant as a compliment. She was 11. She did not have the tools to question it, to consider that her mother was speaking out of her own private pain, rather than any objective truth about an 11-year-old girl. She simply absorbed it, the way children absorb everything said to them by the people they need most, and she spent the next 3 decades quietly working to prove she was nothing like the man her mother resented, sometimes succeeding, often exhausting herself in the effort, never once questioning the actual premise underneath all of it. It was not until she was nearly 40, sitting with her own daughter one evening, that she caught herself about to say something almost identical in a moment of exhaustion, and stopped mid-sentence, suddenly seeing with total clarity, for the first time in her life, that the sentence she had carried for 30 years was never a fact about her at all. It was a wound of her mother's, spoken in a moment of pain, mistaken by an 11-year-old for permanent truth. Before we go further, I want you to notice something, because it will help you recognize whether tonight's message was written for the exact lie you are carrying. People still living under an old, unexamined lie about themselves almost always share the same quiet patterns, even if they have never connected them back to a single sentence from years ago. You over-explain yourself in ordinary conversations, offering justifications nobody actually asked for, as though some invisible jury is still deliberating your worth. You feel a disproportionate flash of shame over small, ordinary mistakes, the kind of shame that seems far too large for the size of the actual mistake. Because the mistake is not what you are really reacting to. You are reacting to old proof. You find yourself either working twice as hard as necessary to prove your value, or quietly giving up before you even try, convinced the outcome is already decided, and you have noticed, more than once, a specific person's voice appearing in your head during moments of failure, not as a memory exactly, but as a live, ongoing commentary track you have mistaken for your own honest self-assessment. If several of these describe you, keep listening, because the rest of tonight's message was written for exactly the version of you that just recognized itself in those words. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something before we go any further. Because right now, you only know half of tonight's message, and the half you know is the half that has kept you small instead of free. Stay with me, because now I want to talk about the specific lie you're carrying, the one you still do not fully recognize, even after everything I have said so far. Here is the second truth, and it is harder to hear than the first. The lie did not stay where it started. It grew a voice of its own inside you, and somewhere along the way, you stopped hearing it as someone else's words and started experiencing it as your own thoughts. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly enough. You are not simply remembering an old insult from years ago. You have an inner voice today, right now, that narrates your mistakes, your appearance, your worth in relationships, your capability at work, and you assume that voice is simply you being honest with yourself. It is not. In most cases, that voice is a ghostwriter, borrowing the exact tone, the exact cruelty, the exact impossible standards of whoever first spoke that original lie to you. And it has been writing your internal narrative in their handwriting for so long that you have forgotten your own handwriting ever looked different. Now here is where it gets harder to hear, so take a breath, because what comes next is the part that will genuinely break your heart tonight, and I am not going to soften it, because you deserve the truth more than you deserve comfort right now. You have built an entire adult life around defending yourself against a lie that the person who told it to you may not even remember saying. This happens more often than anyone wants to admit. The parent who made an offhand comment in a hard season of their own life has long since forgotten it. The teacher who said you were not cut out for something has taught 1,000 other students since and could not pick your face out of a crowd today. The ex who told you that you were too demanding to ever be truly loved has moved on entirely, likely repeating the exact same pattern with someone new, never once circling back to the damage those words did in your life. And yet you are still here tonight, quietly organizing decisions, relationships, and entire seasons of your life around defending yourself against words that the person who spoke them barely remembers uttering. There is a young man I think about often, who spent his entire adolescence being compared, always slightly unfavorably, to an older cousin who excelled easily at everything: sports, academics, easy charm with adults. Nobody in his family ever said cruelly that he was less than his cousin. It was smaller than that, quieter than that. 1,000 tiny comments over 1,000 ordinary dinners, a slight pause before his achievements were acknowledged, an easy, immediate praise for his cousins. By the time he reached his late 20s, he had built an entire personality around being the reliable, unremarkable one, choosing safe paths, avoiding anything that risked drawing comparison. quietly convinced that ambition was simply not his lane the way it was his cousin's. It took a stranger, a colleague at a job he had settled for far below his actual ability, casually remarking one afternoon that she could not understand why someone as sharp as him had never pushed further in his career, to finally crack something open in him that 15 years of quiet, internalized comparison had sealed shut. He went home that night and, for the first time, actually wrote down the specific belief he had been operating under since childhood, and seeing it in his own handwriting, plainly, he said later, was the first time it looked less like a fact and more like an old, tired opinion someone else had handed him decades earlier. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the strangest griefs a person can carry. Spending decades in a courtroom the other person left years ago. Stay with me, because now we arrive at the truth this entire message was built around, the one the title promised you, and I am not going to make you wait any longer for it. The truth is this: that person lied to you, not necessarily out of cruelty, though sometimes it was exactly that, but lied nonetheless, because they described you using the language of their own limitations rather than the truth of who you actually were and are. A parent exhausted beyond their capacity described your intensity as a burden because they did not have the resources that day to see it as a gift. A teacher who had given up on their own dreams years earlier described your ambition as unrealistic because your possibility quietly reminded them of the path they never took. Someone who could not offer real intimacy described your need for honesty and depth as too much because meeting it honestly would have required a version of themselves they were not yet capable of becoming. None of this excuses what was said, but it reveals something you have never fully let yourself see, which is that the lie was never actually a verdict about you. It was a mirror of them, held up so close to your face in a vulnerable moment that you mistook their reflection for your own. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment, because this next part is going to feel deeply personal, almost like I am speaking directly about your own life, and that is because in some way I am. I want you to notice honestly where this old lie still shows up in your life today, in ways you may never have connected back to its original source. Do you shrink your voice in meetings because somewhere long ago you were told you were too opinionated? Do you sabotage relationships the moment they start to feel genuinely safe because somewhere long ago you were told you were too difficult to be loved consistently? Do you overwork yourself into exhaustion, trying to prove a worth that should never have needed proving in the first place? Because somewhere long ago someone made your value conditional on your performance instead of simply your existence. Do you flinch at compliments, quietly deflecting them or explaining them away? Because accepting a kind word at face value would require contradicting the old sentence you have privately accepted as truth for so long? Do you find yourself drawn, again and again, to relationships or workplaces that echo the exact same criticism you received decades ago, almost as though some part of you is still trying to win an old argument with someone who is no longer even in the room? These patterns did not appear from nowhere. They are the long shadow of a single sentence spoken to you by someone who, in that specific moment, was not telling you the truth, even if you have spent your entire life since then treating it as though it was scripture. Here is the second layer of tonight's message, and this one is harder to accept than the first. You already sense, somewhere quiet inside yourself, that this old lie no longer fits who you actually are, if it ever truly did at all. The confusion you feel about finally letting it go is not because the truth is unclear. It is because releasing it requires grieving the years you already spent organizing your life around it, and grief is heavier to carry than denial, at least at first. Nobody around you is going to force you to finally examine this, because most of the people in your life have never even noticed the old lie is still running quietly in the background of your decisions. But deep inside, in the same quiet place where you have always known more truth about yourself than you have allowed yourself to admit out loud, you already know exactly which sentence has been governing your life for far too long. I know there is a version of you listening right now insisting that your situation is different, that the words you carry were not a single offhand comment but a pattern repeated so consistently over so many years that it must have been true. Otherwise, why would it have been said so often? I want to take that seriously rather than dismiss it, because repetition does feel like evidence, and in a child's mind especially, it very easily becomes indistinguishable from fact. But consider this. A person who is limited in one particular way rarely says it only once. If a parent could not tolerate a child's big emotions, They likely said some version of you are too much not once but 100 times, across 100 separate moments, each one feeling to the child like fresh, independent confirmation of an old truth, when in reality, it was the same single limitation in the adult, replayed on a loop. Mistaken by the child for 100 separate proofs. Repetition of a lie does not transform it into truth. It only means the person telling it never grew past the moment they first started telling it. And you have been living inside their unfinished growth ever since, as though it were a verdict about you rather than a record of where they got stuck. I want to tell you about a man who finally confronted his own version of this lie, almost by accident, in the middle of an ordinary, unremarkable week. He had spent 15 years believing, based on a single furious comment from his father during a difficult adolescence, that he was fundamentally lazy, someone who would always need to be pushed harder than everyone else simply to keep up. He had built his entire career around outworking that accusation, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and his own health in a decades-long attempt to disprove a sentence spoken by an exhausted, frightened man during one of the hardest years of his own life. It was not a therapist or a book that finally broke the pattern. It was a single conversation with his own son, who, watching his father collapse from exhaustion after another 18-hour day, asked him plainly why he never seemed to believe he had already done enough. The question stopped him completely, because he realized, standing in his own kitchen, that he did not actually have an answer beyond the one sentence his father had said to him 30 years earlier, a sentence he had never once questioned, only obeyed. Stay with me just a little longer, because there is one more piece of tonight's message left, and this is the one that will stay with you the longest after this video ends. You cannot out-argue an old lie using the same fear that has kept it alive for years. You have likely tried this already, telling yourself in moments of confidence that the old accusation is not true, only to feel it quietly return the next time you fail at something or face rejection. This happens because arguing with the lie on its own terms, using logic and willpower alone, rarely dismantles it completely. What actually dismantles it is naming its true origin, clearly enough that it finally loses its disguise as an eternal fact about you and is revealed instead as what it always was. A single sentence, spoken by a limited, wounded human person in a specific moment, under specific pressures, that was never equipped to define the entire scope of who you were capable of becoming. This is the final truth, and it is the one I want you to remember long after this video is over. The lie was never really about you, even though it has spent years wearing your name. It was a fragment of someone else's pain, handed to you far too early, before you had the tools to recognize it as anything other than truth. And the very fact that you are still here, still listening, still quietly aching over words spoken so long ago, tells me something important. It tells me that some part of you has never fully accepted that lie either, even during the years you organized your whole life around it. And that quiet, persistent resistance inside you is the truest thing you have ever known about yourself, far truer than the sentence you have been carrying. This is the final truth, and it is the one I want you to remember long after this video is over. The lie was never really about you, even though it has spent years wearing your name. It was a fragment of someone else's pain, handed to you far too early, before you had the tools to recognize it as anything other than truth. And the very fact that you are still here, still listening, still quietly aching over words spoken so long ago, tells me something important. It tells me that some part of you has never fully accepted that lie either, even during the years you organized your whole life around it, and that quiet, persistent resistance inside you is the truest thing you have ever known about yourself, far truer than the sentence you have been carrying. Consider, too, what this lie has cost you in the relationships you have built since. How many times have you tested the people who love you now, unconsciously, waiting to see if they would eventually confirm the old sentence, and felt a strange, unexplainable discomfort on the occasions when they did not? How many good things, real affection, real opportunity, real belonging, have you quietly turned away from over the years because some part of you did not believe you were the kind of person such things were meant for? This is perhaps the cruelest cost of an unexamined lie. It does not simply distort how you see your past. It actively edits your present, filtering out evidence that contradicts it and magnifying anything that seems to confirm it, until the life you are actually living becomes a strange, curated echo of a sentence spoken to you decades ago by someone who, in many cases, has long since moved on and thought nothing more of it. So here's what I'm asking you to do tonight. Before you close this video and return to your ordinary evening as though nothing happened, name the sentence. Say it out loud. Once, clearly, exactly as it was originally spoken to you, and then say out loud, immediately afterward, who actually said it, and what you now understand about the pressures and pain they were carrying in that specific moment. This single act of naming does something that years of quiet suffering under the lie could never do. It moves the sentence out of the timeless, eternal category you have kept it in for years and places it back where it always belonged. In a specific moment, spoken by a specific, limited person, under specific circumstances that had far more to do with them than it ever did with you. Then, tomorrow, choose one small action that directly contradicts the old lie, not to prove anything to the person who said it, most of whom will never even know this quiet war has been happening inside you for years, but simply to begin building new evidence for yourself. If the lie told you that you were too much, take up a little more space tomorrow than you normally allow yourself. If the lie told you that you would never amount to anything, take one deliberate step toward the thing you have quietly wanted to attempt for years but never believed you were allowed to try. If the lie told you that you were unlovable exactly as you are, let one person a little closer tomorrow than you usually allow, even if it frightens you, especially if it frightens you. Then, tomorrow, choose one small action that directly contradicts the old lie. Not to prove anything to the person who said it, most of whom will never even know this quiet war has been happening inside you for years, but simply to begin building new evidence for yourself. If the lie told you that you were too much, take up a little more space tomorrow than you normally allow yourself. If the lie told you that you would never amount to anything, take one deliberate step toward the thing you have quietly wanted to attempt for years, but never believed you were allowed to try. If the lie told you that you were unlovable exactly as you are, let one person a little closer tomorrow than you usually allow, even if it frightens you, especially if it frightens you. This work does not finish in a single evening, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. The sentence you have carried for years did not lose its grip the moment you first heard someone question it out loud, and it will likely not lose its grip completely after only one honest night of reflection either. Old lies are patient. They have had years, sometimes decades, to root themselves into the ordinary texture of how you move through the world, into the jobs you chose, the relationships you settled for or avoided entirely, the version of yourself you learned to present because it felt safer than the version you actually were. Expect the old voice to return, especially in moments of stress or failure, speaking in the same familiar tone it always has. When it returns, and it will, the goal is not to silence it perfectly on the first attempt. The goal is simply to recognize it a little faster each time. To say to yourself, there is that old sentence again, that is not actually my voice, that belongs to someone else's unfinished pain, and to keep choosing, again and again, the small daily actions that build a different, truer story in its place. Someone told you a lie a long time ago, and you have spent years believing it without ever fully knowing it for what it was. Tonight, you finally know, and now that you know, the sentence that once quietly ran your entire life no longer gets to run silently in the background any longer. It has been named, it has been placed back where it belongs, and what you build from here, freed from a lie that was never truly yours to carry, is entirely up to you.